So we'll be continuing looking at Reconstruction in the later rounds of Congressional Reconstruction and the election of Ulysses S. Grant as president in 1868. So in 1868, you've got the Democratic candidate as Horatio Seymour going up against the former Union general and very popular Ulysses S. Grant. The real takeaway here is that Grant has no political experience whatsoever. However, of course, we know being a famous general from a war can help you out significantly. And the only real way he's able to achieve the presidency is because of the African-American vote, the former slaves that now have the ability to vote. Over 500,000 of them will vote for Grant, and as a result, that's really what propels him to the presidency itself. As a result, also, you're going to see Congress starting to promote further protection of African-American voting rights, these former slaves, and that's where you see the 15th Amendment in 1870, which is promoting equal suffrage. Basically, all males should be able to vote and should be protected to do so. Also, Congress does one of its last acts to protect civil rights in 1875, and the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was initially to get away from the segregation that was starting to evolve in the South, and it was basically attempting to end a lot of that separate but equal facilities that were springing up across southern states. But unfortunately, the Republican Party and the country as itself is pretty much starting to change its focus. We're over almost several years past the Civil War itself, and after about a decade, a lot of people, especially in Republicans, are focused now on other things, such as the corruption that is rampant, not only through southern states, but northern states as well. Grant's presidency itself is noteworthy for several different scandals, which we'll talk about in our next unit. There's financial panic that sets in 1873. It's been about 20 years. And between financial downturn, the continuing idea of westward expansion, what to do with natives out west, how to admit more states into the Union, the Republicans essentially kind of lose the fight to keep dictating terms to southern states post the Civil War. And so over time, you see what's called these redeemers. These Democrats call themselves the Southern Redeemers, and they'll gradually assume authority back over southern states. Within just a few years of being readmitted to the Union, most of these southern states have now reinstalled a democratically conservative government, which are pretty much going to be able to do what they want. And so we'll take a look at that here next. So the Redeemers era of Reconstruction, this is what we call round 3 and the end of it. So Redeemers are essentially white supremacists who more or less want to return things as much as possible to the status quo prior to the Civil War. The most famous and really infamous group for this would be the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, led by Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, a former Confederate soldier. And the Ku Klux Klan is responsible for terrorizing former slaves across the South, whether it be burning schools, churches, and just in general trying to disenfranchise businesses and African Americans from voting, which then Congress passes the Force Acts in 1870. And these goals is to help give federal authority to put down groups like the KKK. Unfortunately, the Amnesty Act in 1872 is passed. And what that does is it basically removes any limits now of holding office or getting plantations back, anything like that, from former Confederate soldiers, especially higher ranking ones. And as a result now, there's basically no barriers for former Confederates to take back political offices and things like that. So it just only further allows these redeemers to assume control over the southern states again. In fact, the Democrats are in control of the House of Representatives by 1874. One of the reasons also to keep in mind here is that the 3/5 clause that's original to the Constitution is now null and void, and the former slaves now count wholly in representation, which means southern states now have higher representation in Congress. In 1876, the presidential election, Grant wants to run again, but there's so many issues of corruption surrounding his presidency that instead you're going to have the Republicans bring out Rutherford B. Hayes. against Samuel Tilden, Democratic candidate from New York. Tilden was known for his fighting against guys like Boss Tweed in New York, and we'll talk about that next unit. In this vote itself, there are 3 states, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, where the votes are contested. Tilden needed 1 electoral vote from any of those 3 states, just 1 single electoral vote, and he would get the presidency. Because these states were contested, Congress agrees to put together a special electoral commission made up of congressmen and even judges. And the commission itself, 15 members in a party vote, gives the election to Rutherford B. Hayes, and those contested votes essentially will go to him. And so as a result, Rutherford B. Hayes will get the presidency. The Democrats are outraged in Congress itself, and they threaten to filibuster and just evolve this into a hot mess politically. However, literally the day before the inauguration in 1877, compromise is reached between the 2 parties. Hayes will get the presidency, but he has to end military reconstruction. That's the goal. That's what's the deal reached. And not only that, he also promises to build a Southern Transcontinental Railroad and basically help support the South more in its rebuilding efforts. But that military reconstruction piece was what really sealed the end of this phase. Some people would even call this a second corrupt bargain, which we know, of course, the first corrupt bargain being with that Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams election. So what are some of the long-term consequences of Reconstruction? The South itself faces a lot of economic problems, and particularly what will happen is that all the freed former slaves still, just because they have their freedom doesn't mean that economically they're able to get very far ahead. A lot of now poor whites or the former slaves will practice what's called sharecropping. So those plantation owners will allow people to work that land, but they have to give about half of their crop to that plantation owner. So thereby, they're really not able to get ahead. And a lot of these people just actually get into further debt. That's what this debt peonage or debt slavery. So sure, politically and physically they have their freedom, but economically, there's still really no significant advantages for the former slaves or the poor whites of the South. So economically speaking, the advantages haven't really changed hands. Legally, you see the process of Jim Crow laws being put into place across the South, and this idea of de jure racial segregation, which is legal segregation, put into place, and you'll have separate facilities. That's even backed up by Supreme Court cases like Plessy versus Ferguson, which say that separate but equal facilities are legal and okay. And as a result, across the South, you're going to see disenfranchisement, literacy tests, where if you couldn't read and pass a basic test about the Constitution, you couldn't vote. Grandfather clauses put in place where if your grandfather didn't vote, basically before the Civil War, that you thereby couldn't vote. So that not only targeted African Americans, now former slaves, but it also allowed poor whites that maybe couldn't read the opportunity to vote. And then you also see poll taxes, where literally you may have to pay an actual tax to vote or own land, which not a lot of those former slaves did. So basically limiting their political opportunity to advocate for themselves. There's a new culture adjustment that is starting in the South. You actually see a lot of universities established. New independent African-American churches are established across the South. And they'll also use those churches as a way to help band together, especially against groups like the Ku Klux Klan that promote violence and terrible acts. Famous universities like Howard or Fisk are established, so you do see education promoted across the South now for a lot of those former slaves. And you see a lot of migration, especially to the north of the Midwest. We call those exodusters, who are leaving these violent and poverty-stricken areas. And also you see a growing women's rights movement. So now that the war is over itself, as a result in the South, there's so many more women, because so many men in the South had died as a result of the war, that a lot of women are becoming employed, working in the growing industrial areas of the South. And so as a result, you see a growing women's rights movement because they're doing so much as a result of all the death from the war itself. And we already talked about how that the women's rights movement and the abolitionist movement went hand in hand. So women said, great, we've got slaves their freedom, Now, what about rights for women, which we'll see become